Hi, welcome back to the Busy Corner. This is lesson 22. I'm going to show you how to transpose a very basic basic hat pattern from Lion Brand. And I'm wearing it right now. This is done in Hometown, USA. This color is San Diego Navy, I believe. You could choose another type of yarn. This is the same pattern, and this is done in a very fuzzy alpaca that was hard to work with. And when you download this pattern, it is number L0507. It's called Radiant Hat. You don't have to get the first page, but there's another hat pattern on this same website. It's the very same thing. So I'm going to show you it based on, I just put a few stitches on here, just because the main point today is showing you how to transpose the pattern itself. It's very simple. So to make this hat, you will need to have your 3/8 inch oak dowel rods. You may need 2 balls of yarn if you're using some of the marbled colors. They are only 64 yard skeins, something like this. And I used about 65, so you're going to be right on the fence. Even if you use the pom-pom out of another color, you may not have enough. But you'll have plenty if you use a solid color. It does suggest, when you're making a garment, it's always suggested that you make a gauge swatch. And the first thing they'll tell you when you look at a pattern is how to do a gauge swatch for that particular pattern, and it's always different. I don't know how differently we're going to knit, because instead of the yarn being held between our fingers, and that's what dictates your tension when you're knitting, we're using our fingers to manipulate the yarn. I put my stitches on pretty firmly, and you can see that that's pretty tightly knit. Came out even more so with the fuzzy yarn. You can't even tell that that is stockinette stitch, actually. So it may or may not be necessary. The finished size is 19 inches, but we'll see. It would be nice to hear if you'll give me some feedback and let me know how your patterns work out if you don't do your gauge swatch and you just do it as the pattern says. But you're going to cast on 38 stitches according to the pattern, but we'll put on 8 for our little demonstration here. So it wants you to knit 3 rows. That's the first thing the pattern says. So this pattern is for straight knitting needles. If you were using straight knitting needles, you would literally knit 3 rows. Use the knit stitch for 3 rows. We don't do that on the rods. We're going to back stitch or purl stitch our second row. But this is row 1. When you're working on these small sticks or rods, whatever you make it out of, refer to some of my earlier videos. You know, it's kind of tricky to work a stitch that's so small. I'll try to keep my hands out of the way for the camera, but I like to keep my yarn, as always, in my right hand and let my working yarn more or less drape over the end of my index finger when I take that off, so that I can use my index finger to push the yarn up through the stitch and grab it. And you can tighten that back bit down towards the cast off on row, and again, you're just going to use your finger, whichever finger you want to use, to push the yarn through the stitch. And you make sure you get the whole thing. As I've used this yarn to demonstrate, it is getting, you see how the strands have all separated. Some yarn will just do that anyway. So you want to make sure that you have all those strands as you bring it through. I'm exaggerating my left hand here. I try to stay out of the way of the camera. Notice on these small stitches, I don't have very much space. The stitch is so small that I don't have very much space to pull off my old stitch, or the previous stitch to make a new one. These are going to want to slide forward, so you want to keep your hands down below there to prevent that. Once you have 3 or 4 stitches, new stitches made on the other pipe, it won't have a tendency to slide forward as much. You just want to make sure you don't drop a stitch while you're making the new ones. And you can see that I snug that up pretty firmly, and I did that because I wanted to make sure it would fit my head, not be too big, And your band is where it's going to stretch out the most. This isn't a ribbing band, it's garter stitch, which I think is actually more attractive than a ribbed band. So there's row 1. Now we're going to knit row 2. And we need to back stitch this row, and you could do it 2 ways. You can either have the yarn up, remove the stitch, being careful not to pull off any more other stitches with it. Hold it up, lay the working yarn across the back, poke it through with your finger, pull the new stitch up. You could push the old stitch down a bit, kind of tighten it up before you pipe it, and now bring off another stitch. Make careful that you don't pull off the new stitch you made. Lay your working yarn behind the stitch. This is one way to do them. I sometimes think this is faster. So yeah, I use my finger just to poke the yarn up through. Another way you can make the stitch is below the pipes, in which case you'll still keep the yarn in your left hand, and you'll take the stitch and move it on to your right finger and lay the working yarn across the back, basically the side even. You don't even have to turn it all the way over, just hold it on its side. Take your finger and poke that yarn right through there. And when you do, it's going to look like this, and you want to put it on the pipe like that. So use your left hand to remove the yarn, remove the stitch, holding your yarn in your left hand, lay it right across the stitch, and poke it through. So either method works. It's just going to depend on what feels more comfortable. If you have any issues with your wrist or fingers, your stitch will look like this when you put it up on the rod. We'll do one more. I like to just flop it right onto my finger like that. That helps the stitch open up a little bit and prepares it to push the yarn through. Make sure you have all the strands if your bulky yarn is starting to separate. Alright, that's row 2, and we'll do one more row. This is row 3 of the garter stitch section. So just as before, I like to, on these small ones, I like to take my, once I've taken that first stitch off, take the old stitch and push it back down towards your knitting, and then pull on your working yarn to snug it up. You can even take your yarn, push it up a bit there, take the old stitch, push it towards the knitting so that you open up your stitch a bit more. These are very small holes, so the bulkier your yarn and the darker it is, the harder it will be to see your stitch. You almost have to feel it. And that alpaca was so hairy that the hairs actually got sort of blocked the hole. If you give yourself a little slack on your working yarn as you're making the stitch, then it's easier. Notice I have a little bit of slack right here. It's easier to push it through the old stitch. If it seems like you don't have much space, just take your knitting and push it up a little bit. Take your working yarn, push it through. It takes a little more time to form these stitches, but I've timed it and it's about the same as knitting needles. It's using 15 knitting needles. Okay, so that was row 3. Now it wants us to begin our body of our hat. And the next direction says, beginning with a purl row, work in STST, which is stockinette stitch, by knitting on the right side, it's abbreviated, and purl on the wrong side for 21 rows. If you do that, you want to remember that now this is an even number row. So although the pattern, and this is for straight needles, so although the pattern tells me to begin with a purl row, in other words, backstitch that, I know I need to reverse that row, just like we did in the garter stitch section. So that would mean I'd front stitch that if I want to do exactly what the pattern said. That's what I did on this hat. You can see the border there. It's more obvious on this. Okay, so I said when I made the blue hat, that looked a little narrow to me, and I was afraid it was going to roll. And I like my brim to stay flatter so that it stays on my head better. So I didn't do what the pattern said. Well, I did do what the pattern said. Exactly. I didn't reverse this row, if you get my drift. I actually added another garter stitch row. So instead of knitting this as I would for the pattern, if I'm transposing it exactly, I actually did another row of back stitches. But I'm just going to, for the sake of the pattern, you know, that's how it'll come out. So if you do it what the pattern says, then that means you should reverse this row and do front stitches if you want it to come out like the pattern directions, which is a narrower section of the garter stitch, or like this. But if you want it to be like my blue hat, you will do what the pattern says and knit another row of back stitches, because you want your garter stitch section to be wider. This is where you reset your clicker no matter what you do. Whether you want your garter stitch brim to be wider, or, as the pattern says, reset your clicker to 1. And now your odd numbers are going to be on this left-hand side. But the reason you're doing it is that body of 21 stitches is, now you're starting to count over again, because that's what you're working on. So the pattern says to purl a row, and we know we need to do the opposite for the to make it look like the pattern says. So that means we're going to front stitch that row. So we'll do it just like it says. Now I'm kind of turned around here. See how I actually did that backwards? I'm kind of sitting way to the right here, so I'm out of the way of the camera. It should look like that when you put it on. Your working yarn should be on the inside. Now my hands reversed here. You can use either finger to push it through. You see how I had my hands backwards? It's easier if you, for me, if I have the working yarn in my hand the whole time, and if I'm working from the left pipe to the right, to have the working yarn in my left hand. And that's your last stitch. And you're going to do that for 21 rows. You're going to make them all front stitches. If we were doing this on straight needles, we would have to do knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, back and forth. When you get done to your 21 rows, that's when you do your decrease. So we're going to do one more row of stockinette stitch, just so it'll be a little easier to show you the decrease on this. And it's a very, very simple decrease. You see how these stitches are so small? You can even take your finger with the yarn in it before you knit it to push back that old stitch, just to give you a little more space. Especially if you do like me and really snug those up. Alright, I'll give us a little more slack. Now, our decrease on this is very simple. It says K2 together, which is abbreviated K2 TOG, to the end of the row, and you'll have 19 stitches at the end of the row. And all they want you to do is what I showed you in the triangle scarf. To knit two together, and you have to imagine it from sitting on the other side. If you were looking at the knitting needles and they were in your hands, you would normally you would take the knitting needle up through those stitches to bring the yarn back through. But we're going to take one at a time off, and we're going to lay it over our index finger with the working yarn on it, like so. And you want to push it up there enough. You can see that separated a little bit, so make sure they're together. And bring off your next stitch, because you need two. But take one at a time, and that'll make it easier to widen that out a bit. Lay it over your working yarn. So now you have your working yarn up through two of the stitches, push them down, and pipe it. let's do that again. So you have your yarn in your left hand. If you're working left to right, make your stitch big enough that you can put your finger through a good ways, because you need another stitch on here now. This gets a little tricky. You got to make sure you don't lose your previous stitch or the other old stitches. Use your thumb if you need to and kind of widen that out a bit before you put it over your finger. And there's my working yarn, and grab it. This will be a little tricky. I've tried doing this a number of ways. I even tried using a crochet hook, but I think it's simpler just to take your time on this row. And again, use your thumb. Once you've taken out that second stitch, you'll be pulling on the first, and it will make this seam even tighter. So just take your time and slowly stretch it. There you go. Now you can see your working yarn poking through. Pull the working yarn up and pipe it. Make sure that your working yarn is coming around and dropping down to the inside of the pipes. We'll do that again. So just make sure you open that up a little bit. You can push the old stitch up, put your working yarn through with your, give it a little bit more length on your index finger so that you have room for the last stitch. And this is going to be the tricky one. Make sure you don't let go of it. Take your thumb and push down a little bit on that stitch if you need to widen it. Or even take your other finger and kind of work it through a bit. Then lay it over, take your time, and push the working yarn up through there. And that is how you're going to do your decrease. And you'll notice that once you've done that and you're looking at the row, when you knit two together, it leans just a little bit to the right. You can see that. And if you're working a garment, like a sweater or a vest, there's a decrease for the other side of the garment that leans the other way. So know that if you were doing something that had, and sometimes those kind of decreases are combined to make it give interest to a piece if it's done in sections. But so that's what knit two together means. Now, once you've done that, this hat is ready to come off. So let's switch our pipe out. We actually need to take a one off. Let's see. But we'll take them both, just I'm not sure which is going to be the easiest to see. Alright, so now put this up on your pipe. Up on your stand, I mean. And you can see that here's my working yarn coming around the back of this. Leave yourself about, 18 inches. Because you're going to weave this back through. So go ahead and cut it. And now here is my working yarn coming through, and you're going to thread this onto a darning needle. Make sure it's either a big eye or one of those open needles. And all you need to do now is take your needle and make sure you're not piercing the yarn. And you want to, I like to just take my fingers actually and pull my stitch out a little bit, enough that I can get the needle. And I can make sure that I'm not splitting the yarn. You want to make sure you're going under the stitch. And you see how I'm pulling this out so that I can get the needle underneath. And take your time, because if you are using very fuzzy yarn, it's very easy to put the needle where you don't want it to be. And you're going to gather all these stitches after you've woven them through. So you just pull out the stitch, insert the needle, and work your way down. As you do that, you could even start dropping them off, but I think it's easier to leave them on the pipe. And then and that way you don't accidentally miss one, and it's not heavy if it's in your hand. And you can see that I'm getting all, make sure that your yarn is long enough, because you need to gather all the stitches. That's why I say leave yourself about 18 inches. And then you'll use these tails. You want to have enough tail from your cast on and your cast off to weave your seam together. And your knitting books will have diagrams that will show this better than I'm going to show it, but I'm still going to show you when we get to that point. Now you're through all of them. Now you can go ahead and take it off, because it's not going to fall apart. And now you pull this firmly. Now, when you do, you can see that it will close up fairly tightly. But, you know, that's still bulky yarn. You're going to have a little bit of an opening. And that's why God made pom-poms. Because every hat that is designed this way always gets a pom-pom. So, that's what covers the little hole. Now, you can go ahead at this point and you can close your opening, or if you want, you can leave that aside while you begin your, or leave it undone till you finish sewing it up. So, what you want to do, and I think, here's my little board here. Alright, there's a couple ways of sewing these up, and I didn't do such a hot job on this one. I kind of started one way and then I changed my mind and I started using what's called one stitch in, and I think it looked better. This really doesn't matter how you seamed it because you can't see the stitches. What you do want to be careful of is the very bottom of the garter stitch row, and it's better to make a little yarn bridge there. I didn't do it on this hat, and you can see how there's a little bit of an indentation there. And if anything spoils the look of the hat, see, I did the same thing. I forgot about that. You need to kind of create a little land bridge, if you will, just like I do on those knitting hoops. But what you're going to want to look for is this. If you are using very plain yarn, this is my point here. Take your yarn, take your hat like this, and now you're going to have your right sides on the top. So it looks like this. You'll notice how these are curled in. And that is the best way to sew it up and make sure that you have all the edges correct. And it's better to start down here, because if you start up here and work your way down and find these aren't even, well, that looks dumb. So you have to start down here at the bottom of the hat. And I'm going to show you something about this. Some people will tell you to knit. See if I can point this out. This is going to be hard to do. You can, oh, and here's another way to do it too. You could do it with your wrong sides together. If you're using very bulky yarn and you catch, this is one way, these stitches, this and this. But notice, if I do it with the blunt needle, notice how I start to split that. So some people say, take a crochet hook in there, in those stitches, and those are going to be the ones you join, the ones on the very edge. But an even more, and you'll do that all the way up the seam, an even more invisible way is to catch these bars. Let me take that needle off a second. If you take your hat and hold it like this, there's the stitch on the edge, the first one that turns. If you pull that and look at the space between that stitch and the row of stockinette next to it, the first and second stitches, you'll see these bars. Well, they're present everywhere, but in particular you're looking for this one right along this edge. It's those bars. Let me hold it back down here again. When you look in your book, sometimes it's called one stitch in, and if you went along and did those bars, that's not any better, is it, honey? There. If you go along with your needle now and you knit your bars in what's called a mattress stitch, and if I had my darning needle like so, I would go in to that bar like so. Obviously I'd start down here, but then you'd come over here and do the same thing and find that bar that matches it along the row and do the same thing. And you would work that back and forth, back and forth. Many books say do 6 stitches this way and tightly, and then pull on the garment a little bit, and then it will have the same stretch. If you're using a darning needle, you have to be very careful that you're not splitting the yarn when you do this. On a hat like this, you know, you might be able to just go every other stitch. But let me show you what happens as you do this. So pull it apart. There's your, make sure you're getting the whole yarn. pull it tightly. You're just pretending now. And now, look what happens. You don't even see that stitch. It's this portion I'm referring to. So I think that's the most attractive way of sewing up the back. Obviously, you're going to start down here and then begin that. And once you get to the very top of the hat, if you run out of yarn before then, you'll knot it right in the seam. And then you can use this end, where you ended the hat and cast off, to first knot that so it stays together and you can meet the other direction. But definitely start at this end and start with your little border, and then you'll be done.